Before we begin to paint, I want to show you how to lay out a palette. So this is a review. The white is to the left. If you have black, it'll go all the way to the right side of wherever you're laying out your colors. It's always good to begin with the warms first. So if you were to divide this setup in half, the warms would be to the left and the cools would be to the right. So when we're talking about temperature, we're talking about temperature in terms of color. Think the colors of fire for warm, and for cool, you want to think of ocean stuff or in a cool forest. So here's one way to lay out some tints and tones and shades. So you can kind of pre-mix some black and whites. You can use the actual black for that, and then you just add more colors to the black or to the gray or to the white. As a reminder, you're starting off with 2 little marks, and they should be about an inch, no bigger than 2 inches at the most. And once you use a color 2 times, then you can no longer use that exact hue. You have to now adjust it in some way. So like with the yellow, you can readjust it by adding white, or you can add the 2 yellows together and that'll make a different hue. Or you can add another color like red to the yellow. So sometimes students like to do a bunch of warm colors. So I'm starting off kind of working my way through the color wheel, and that's a good way to begin. Just as a reminder, when you're doing this, part of the assignment is to get you used to holding the brush correctly. That means holding it at the back half, so either on that black line or on the turquoise part of the handle is where you're going to be holding that brush. Try and get a variety of marks out of each brush. So you have a few different brushes. They differ in terms of size and they can differ in terms of shape too. There's brushes that are flat at the top, and there's some called a filbert that have a round kind of point to it, so slightly round. And then there's an actual round brush, which looks like a detail brush. It's completely round. So when you're doing this, you want to experiment with the kind of mark you can make with each brush. Sometimes you want to create a very skinny line, so you would use the edge of your brush to do a skinny mark. Sometimes you want to use the wide side of your brush. What I don't want you to do is to fuss with the marks. That means you put down one stroke, you kind of dart in and dart out, and then you leave that stroke alone. So if the mark doesn't look attractive, who cares? It's just for practice, and the tick mark exercise is abstract anyway, so I wouldn't overthink it. A lot of artists get into trouble when they try to overcorrect a mark that they make. Starting out, it should look kind of like confetti is being tossed onto your paper, but over time, you're going to fill in most of those gaps. So at the end of the tick mark exercise, you should have maybe 10% of the white of the paper showing. Everything else should be covered with acrylic paint. And it is good and encouraged, required, to have overlapping marks too. So it should be one stroke and then you put another on top. Even if you obscure it, it's not the end of the world. The exercise is so that you learn to mix as many colors on your own as you possibly can. And it's good to try and match colors, because so much of what we do as artists is try to get a similar match to what we're looking at either in real life or from photographs. Here's what's going to go inside of your 5x7 rectangle that we've been avoiding all this time. So you get to pick an Impressionist painting and you're going to replicate it, so reproduce it using tick marks, which is the actual technique that Impressionist painters use, and you're going to be applying that in your 5x7 rectangle. So I'm going to do a reproduction of a Claude Monet painting. This is a painting of a vase filled with flowers. When you are painting from a photograph, I think it's really smart to have your photo positioned on the same plane as your painting. So that means I would clip it to your board or take a piece of blue tape and secure that to your board so that you can glance just a little bit to the left or to the right and kind of look back and forth from the actual reference to your painting. So we are approaching this with the idea of tick marks. So that means tiny little strokes. You actually need to go even smaller than an inch because you're reproducing a giant painting in a postcard size. So we're going to try and replicate the same strokes as the artist. That means you're going to have to pay attention to color matching. I would also look at the direction of the stroke that the artist is using. Is it a curvy stroke? Is it vertical? Is it angled? It's kind of good to process, like, why are they using that stroke there, like in the background? How is this helping the painting? Like on the vase, he's using kind of a curved stroke, so I tried to replicate that too. So you're going to have to look close at your reference. Some of these colors are a little bit difficult. These are muted colors, which means like in the background here, it's a combination of really yellow, magenta, and a blue. And I'm using ultramarine and cerulean for that. If you get the colors wrong, it's not that big of a deal because you're going to be layering. So when you're doing a painting like this, you are going to be putting on multiple layers. So that background so far has about a layer and a half. So in some places it has 2 layers, in other places it only has 1, but I'm going to continue to build on those layers. With each successive layer, your painting will get stronger. Now, layering does not mean paint thick. You actually need to apply paint thinly, but not watered down. So I have very little water on my brush. The only time I actually use water is to rinse my brush to change to a different color. In that case, I would blot it with a paper towel. So pinch your brush hairs between a paper towel. The goal is to try and to create a reproduction of the painting and make it look similar to the painting that you see there. So most of these are going to be oil paintings that we're trying to reproduce. I work from dark to light, so you can pick an area or a plane to start off first. Like I obviously went to the background first, or I went to the foreground, then the background, and now I'm going into the foliage. And lastly, I'm going to go in and get those flowers. Here's an up close of what was happening to the vase. There's a form shadow, and that vase, it's a cylinder, so I have to keep that in the back of my mind as I'm painting it, like I'm trying to replicate a round object. So round objects are a little bit harder to do than a flat form. I would say use your smaller brushes that you have, but don't feel like you need to get a super fine, skinny brush to get some detail. You really don't need detail. That's one of the mistakes that a lot of young artists make, is they'll go for the skinny brush first, and that will take you forever. It's much better to use a brush that's a little bit too big than one that's like a micro brush with 2 hairs. You're going to get way better at painting, and you're going to be able to finish on time too. So keep looking at the direction of the stroke, like those petals there, they're radial, which means they're like a sunshine, and they're like radiating from the point of the flower. If you have trouble color matching, you're welcome to call me over. It's more important, though, that you get the correct values. So the darks in relationship to the midtones and in relationship to the lights. It's an Impressionist painting, which means it does not have to be perfect. They're a little bit sloppy by nature because they are expressive. So don't feel like yours isn't good enough. I'm going to tell you right now, it probably is. Just be prepared to build your layers. And sometimes that can be frustrating because you feel like it looked perfect in layer 1, but that is part of the painting experience, whether you can replicate something a second or even third time. Most painters put a minimum of 3 coats of paint on their paintings. If you have a number of tick marks already on your page, then I would go ahead and pick the Impressionist painting. Now, if you don't like any of the paintings that I'm offering, you're welcome to suggest one of your own. Just call me over and show me an image, and then you'll have to email it to me, and it's likely that I can print out a copy for you to look at.